in order we might discover that for ourselves. And so a little bit of Israel's history, um, again, starting with Deuteronomy, that these major plot points and events that happen in Israel's history, obviously post Exodus, the Exodus event, I cannot overstate it anymore. And I bring this up in Biblit, and I'm going to continue to do it here in our class, that the Exodus event has a radical impact on the Hebrew thought, imagination, their conception of God, everything of how they organize themselves. This is the event in the Hebrew imagination, the Exodus. And so this being post-Exodus, you have the Israelites that go into, Canaanite towns. That hints at a probable invasion, though as you read in Joshua, that may or may not necessarily have been the case. They actually go and they dwell with those that are in the land of Canaan, which proves to be problematic. So the Hebrew tribes settle in Canaan. And then you have there from about 1020 to 1000 BCE that Saul will reign as the first king of Israel. Again, in response to Israel needing a king after the time of Judges. And so you have during the establishment, you have David who captures Jerusalem, and the Jebusites who are dwelling there. And this will bring about the rise of Israel. This isn't stuff that you have to memorize or write down necessarily, but again, it's good to jog our memory about what's going on that will tie into what we're talking about here today in Genesis. And Solomon as the king of Israel. So Solomon's going to reign. Of course, we know that he builds the temple. It happens there right around 950. But then you're going to have Israel that's going to get in the mix with the nations around them, specifically Assyria, and then later on Babylon in the south. You have Israel being conquered by Assyria in 721 BCE. Then you have Sennacherib of Assyria, who's going to sack the city or take over the city of Lachish, but will fail to take over Jerusalem. Who will end up doing that? Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar at around 597, and then is going to be completely taken over by 587, 586 BC. So then you have the fall of Babylon, who is conquered by Cyrus of Persia, who allows the Jews to return home. And then you have that beginning of Second Temple Judaism happening at around 500 BC, and it's going to go all throughout to about 70 when Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans. And so this is the period that not only is Jesus familiar with, but this is ultimately where we get a lot of the development of the Old Testament, and more specifically, the compilation of what we have and what we know today, very likely that is the Pentateuch. It's some thought that it's during this period of Second Temple Judaism that this is when the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible got put together in the form that we know it now. Again, which is why that idea of form criticism is important and the time frame in which it happens, because you can imagine that if you are a Hebrew who's just gotten out of exile, that the Exodus event of how God delivers his people hits a little different. That to be reminded both in exile and after exile about the God who creates also liberates, and the God who liberates also creates, that he's making a people for himself after this chaotic exile experience, that you can imagine what it then does again to their imagination, to their faith, to their ability to once again go back to Jerusalem and to worship in the temple again, even if it's not the same as it was before, which it absolutely isn't. And it actually is a point of conflict for them. And so, again, you can imagine that where and when these, not only when these things get put together, that it's important, but it's also a point of understanding and at least considering when this stuff gets put together. And as we talk through Genesis again, I'm not going to necessarily point out so much here and tell us to remember history as much as it is to consider that when the events start getting put together are going to have an effect and impact on how Israel understands God. Again, the tie together between exile and these early events in which God was first forming his own people. And so, are there any questions about that? Any questions about this? Does it make sense First, I need to ask that. Does it make sense? I'm going to take a poll. It doesn't make sense. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to take a poll for that. Is this making sense? You give me the thumbs up, thumbs down, kind of like a little bit. Okay, we got a lot of thumbs up. All right, if not, again, please slow me down, because I know, again, this is a lot of content and I don't want anybody to get lost with it. All right, sweet. That to be reminded, a lot of the reason this is going to get put together is, again, to tell a specific story about who God is and how God's people ought to orient themselves in the world. And so, again, that being said, what we're going to do, we're going to take a little bit of an overview of all broad strokes of literary structure of the Pentateuch. And let me make sure this is actually in here. Okay, cool. So starting with Genesis, what you have with Genesis 1 through 11 are these kind of modified early stories that Genesis, in Hebrew, you have that word in the beginning, Bereshith, that is the first details about everything that happens in the beginning. That it's a story of beginnings, the beginnings of God creating the world, the beginnings of God creating these first two humans, the beginnings of God, the issues that come up and how sin just gets everything so messy and complicated. You have the beginnings of issues between humans, like with Cain and Abel. And then you have the beginnings of the issues, again, with what happens with Noah and the flood and violence that prevails on the earth and how God deals with it. And then promises to not deal with chaos, or not to deal with sin the same way. And so Genesis will lay out a lot of the, I guess if you want to think of it kind of like a railroad, it'll lay a lot of track that will then help us to move forward with the rest of the Pentateuch and indeed the rest of the Bible. And so you have these modified versions. And again, you guys will know this from your cultures class, so hopefully it doesn't come as too much of a shock, that there's a lot of similarities between the stories, but there are some specifics in that it's demythologized. And what I mean by that is that there's no presence of magic. God doesn't have to do some kind of like hocus pocus, alakazam. I said this last semester and I forgot it every time. So Jake, maybe you remember again. What's the thing that Harry Potter says? The first one when they're fighting the big old troll. And any other Harry Potter fans, you guys will know.
Wingardium Leviosa.
There you go. Every time I always forget it. Thank you for that. There's none of that in these first two chapters. It just God talks and it happens. And that what happens in the second chapter is that God is going to breathe. He's going to form. He's going to get his hands dirty with these humans and be able to, again, he's going to turn into a gardener. As he's working with this dirt, he's going to get his lips dirty as he's blowing air into these humans. And so again, that's going to be a lot of the differences between the stories that we find within the Pentateuch and the stories that are around in the ancient Near East. Because as a lot of you know, that other stories the gods procreate and this other deity comes forth. The one deity kills another deity, and all of a sudden that blood forms the waters. And there's just different stories that happen, but that's nowhere in the text. That Yahweh, he has in Yahweh, and I'll talk about this in a minute, he has no equal. He's not in competition with any deity. He's not trying to fight somebody off in order to capture his kingdom. Yeah, there's some subduing that needs to happen with creation, but by and large, that's in partnership with humanity and our task, again, to subdue creation. But what Genesis lays out for us, again, is Yahweh being this king who's seated on the throne with no other competition, no other rival, which proved to be, again, this is it'll get messy once Egypt comes into the mix, because especially with the plagues. And the plagues will address, again, this kind of rivalry between these two kings. And so Genesis 12 through 50, known as the patriarchal narratives. And again, the stories of the fathers of the forefathers, or ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their households. And so again, these are broad strokes. You're going to have a lot of stories in there, and they're going to be told in a way that mirrors Genesis, the themes of Genesis 1 through 11, creation themes. And again, we can't just think purely in terms of nature creation, but then also Yahweh's creation of life, because what you see happen again with Abraham and Sarah. And just a quick thing, if you know off the top of your head, what's the issue for Abraham and Sarah?
They can't have a kid, or
Exactly.
they don't think they can.
Yeah, Sarah's barren. Isaac and Rebecca, what's their issue?
Doesn't Isaac have 2 wives?
Well, most specifically Rebecca, it's Jacob that has 2 wives.
They can't have kids.
Exactly. Barrenness, again, emptiness, where Yahweh has to create life, that the Yahweh has to get involved in creating life within the womb. And so again, Yahweh, he's not taking on this whole new kind of like superpower as much as he is being who he is from Genesis 1 through 11. And now it just kind of takes a little bit of a different form. Whereas he's speaking and he's forming, again, now he's creating life within the womb. And so again, that you see the same kind of theme will come up again in Exodus, but we'll get there. We'll get there. And so Exodus 1 through 19, these rescue narratives. And again, the reason why I bring up rescue more specifically, one is because we understand rescue more so than, we don't really use Exodus or exile or those kinds of things, but we do understand rescue. Rescue Rangers. Great cartoon. And so I was thinking Rescuers Down Under too, but anyway. So you have, again, Yahweh who's redeeming his people, who's rescuing his people from the hand of the Egyptians. And then you have those wilderness narratives of how Yahweh provides for his people in the wilderness. And we'll work through some of that. And then you have a covenantal response to rescue. I had brought up last week how covenant is a response, a relational response to salvation or rescue. That covenant is a response to rescue. And so you have there in Exodus 20 to 24, the Sinai covenant, or what we know as the 10 Commandments. It's a little more elaborate than that, but the basics are there. And then you have this weird event in Exodus 31 through 34 where already fresh off of the honeymoon, Yahweh's rescued his people. But yet here they're going to go off and wander. Does somebody have their hand up? Okay. I thought I saw a little.
No, sorry. Someone walked by my room and I just.
You're good. All right. And then if you're wondering why there's a little blank between 25 to 30, because those are more, 20 should really go all the way up to 30. There's more explication here in the rest of the 5 chapters here, talking about the rest of what's happening there. So, and then you have Exodus 35 through 40, tabernacle implementation. And then this is where I'll bring it up again when we get there, but just kind of off the front end, it's really important to understand when we get to this part, and it seems really, really boring because you read through all these details about gold and about how this thing should be measured this size and this thing should be measured that size. But to see the kind of grace that Yahweh is extending towards his people, that they don't just have to make things up, that the way that they go about worshiping, it's not something they have to figure out on their own and just kind of hit and miss and hope that they get it right eventually. But no, that Yahweh is giving these things as a gift that they might know the ways in which they ought to worship. And so, again, I know it makes for really, really dry reading. You guys do have to read a little bit of it. But even more, again, in Leviticus, to be able to see these kinds of things as Yahweh's grace being extended to a people that all they've known is slavery and oppression their whole lives, but yet Yahweh comes to teach them the ways in which they ought to be his people. And so to be able to see these texts, again, as a compassionate rereading of Yahweh's orienting their worlds in such a way to where now, where all they knew was oppression, now they're coming to know freedom that comes by way not just of being completely free of any obligation, but rather but being servants of Yahweh, and how that brings actual freedom and not just being oppressed by pharaohs and the pharaohs that still linger on today. And so Leviticus, again, it's all about the way worship is being ordered for God's people. That you're going to find that this thing is broken up into 7 major units that go back and forth between law and narrative. And so again, interesting that we find that even in what we might call a kind of rule book, there's still narratives that are embedded within this book. And Leviticus, just fun name, it just means of the Levites or pertaining to the Levites. And that's the priesthood, the ways in the people that were in charge of ordering sacrifices, making sacrifices in the tabernacle. And so to read this quote here, the narratives allude to one another and serve as structural indicators on for the developing thought of the legal sections. These deal consecutively with sacrifices, cleanness, holiness, and redemption. And so again, that you have Israel's traditions being developed as they're on the move. They don't get the blueprints from A to Z all the way through, but rather it's being constructed as they go along. And so again, even with how we come to think of, even for us today, that we want so much to know everything that's going to happen, everything that will happen, and the ways in which we ought to go. But the one thing is certain of what God demands, and that's obedience. But again, as Yahweh is working with this people to develop them as his people, that you have these kinds of developments and movements that are happening. And Leviticus is invasive, really invasive, to the points where one, I had mentioned last class how nothing is not without God's presence, and how Hebrew thought is that there's prayer that pervades everything because God pervades everything. And the Leviticus will cover everything from boils to women's menstruation, all the way to what happens when there's a cyst or something that's found on the male parts. And so again, that it's invasive, but again, we can see this either as a really uncomfortable, like over-parenting thing, or which I think the better reading is that God's care for his people, even in the most, I would say the most private of places, that even Yahweh doesn't really mind being able to help them to understand not only how to care for their own bodies, but the extension of Yahweh's care for their bodies as well. We're going to see here also the inclusion of texts relating to how to be a good neighbor, of the ways in which immigrants and strangers ought to be treated, and that it's really important to Leviticus that worship isn't devoid or isn't removed from the ways in which people participate in the world. And that's really important. I'm going to bring it up, that it's not just about the songs they sing, the sacrifices they make, but also the ways in which they treat people. That you're going to see ethics, the way people live, merge with worship, and the ways people participate in their lives with God, and that it's integrally linked. And so again, we'll talk about that when we get there. So Numbers is all about their journey in the wilderness. Yahweh's taking them out of the land of Pharaoh, out of the house of Egypt, from the house of slavery. And so they're going to be journeying in the wilderness, and there's going to be a lot of bumps on the road. And the way this book can be divvied up in broad strokes is in 3 divisions. You can have these first 10 chapters, which are in the wilderness of Sinai. The next about 11, 12 chapters are going to be from Sinai to Kadesh. And I know this is going to be a little bit foreign, but I'll talk about it when we get there. And the next about 14 chapters is going to be Moses talking to the people as they're on the steeps of Moab, about to enter into the promised land. And so you have this other, if you guys know what a chiasm is, what a chiasm is that you have these two related parts at the ends. And you see the three prime, that's what that little quotation mark means for. Again, each part is reflective of the other part. But what matters most is what's happening here in the middle, as it's kind of leading you towards this middle section here. And I don't know why I said leading like that. Leading. I don't know why I said it like that. But anyway, this middle section is the most important. That you have Aaron's sons must bear the guilt for the sanctuary, and that the red heifer ashes and water to cleanse the people, sanctuary not enough. That there's something going on here with the stories in Numbers that will let us know that again, this event is central to understanding the book as a whole and the point of the book. And again, we'll get there when we talk about it, but there's something happening in Numbers where there's going to be a shift in God's relationship with this first generation that's been delivered from Pharaoh. And those of you, again, that have already read through this, you'll know that the first generation doesn't make it. The first generation doesn't make it. And the rebellion that consistently happens here with the spies complaining, and then rebellion that happens, this is going to be one of the main points about the conflict that comes up between God and Israel. Tragically. And so Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is going to consist of 3 speeches made by Moses, but again, the whole book itself follows as a structure of an ancient Near Eastern treaty. And you have this diagram here for you to kind of see. Here's the prologue, the essence of the laws, the core laws, which again make up the bulk of the teaching, curses and blessings. You have covenant renewal, that's going to be another block, and then the epilogue. I'll elaborate more when we get to Deuteronomy, but again, if we just read this purely as law, we're going to miss it and just think it's purely legal. Because there was a different way that I wanted you guys to see law. Do you guys remember how I said it's better interpreted?
Instruction.
Hey, there you go. Nice. So it's better, again, better read as instruction. And especially for this new generation that will appear in Deuteronomy, that the intention is for both Moses and for God and the new generation, not just to enter into the promised land, but to stay into the promised land. And even more than that, to be able to reflect Yahweh in the new territory that they're entering into. So by participating in this, they fulfill their obligations to covenant and reflect God in the world, which again, that's why they're there. And so again, I'll talk about it more when we get there, but there's going to be once again a relationship between the essence of their worship, what they do and who they worship, what they say about God, what they believe about Yahweh, and how they treat other people. And there's going to be an integral link there as well. I've said before in Biblit, for those of you that haven't had me before, you may or may not have heard this, but I know you've heard me before. But wherever there's injustice, idolatry is somewhere on the scene. That idolatry and injustice are often found together, if not always found together. And I hate saying words of finality like always, but that tends to seemingly be the case. And so again, that the prevalence of not just injustice today, but throughout what Israel's history will be, that it'll show you that Israel's got an idolatry problem, and that still sticks with us today. And we'll talk about that when we get to both Genesis and then especially Exodus, and then complaining in Numbers, all these kinds of things we'll talk about when we get there. But the reason why I bring all that up is because what Deuteronomy is trying to get at, again, is a kind of single-hearted loyalty and devotion, which we use the word love to signify. And we'll talk about that. Because again, we get the kind of introduction of love, and it's a lot more than just emotional ties to another individual. All right. So before we jump into Genesis, are there any questions so far? About the Pentateuch as a whole? One of the questions that you might have just in general about the Old Testament? Any questions so far? So again, that's really the main layout the Pentateuch, of what we're going to be going through and what we're going to be talking about throughout this semester. So I did want to give you guys a couple of minutes at least to think and to sit with this. If you guys did have any questions.
This might be a dumb question, but the
Never a dumb question.
PowerPoint's okay. This might be I almost said it again. Is this gonna be posted on Moodle?
The lecture or the PowerPoint?
Oh, the PowerPoint.
It is. It should be on Moodle, is it not?
Oh, I don't know. I was just figured I'd ask now. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
it's on
Oh, yeah.
Moodle. I'm writing it down right now.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sweet. I say, yeah, it should be on Moodle. I posted it last night, so hopefully nothing weird happened. But let me go ahead and check for you real quick. Yeah, it's there. Pentateuch week 2, session 1. All right. All right, anybody else? Any other questions? Either throw them in the chat or unmute yourself.
What is your favorite book to go through in the Pentateuch, personally?
Exodus. That, not only because that's where so much of our theology starts out. I do post a lecture videos too. But more specifically with Exodus, it's just a wild place. God doesn't show up for 2 chapters as things go from bad to worse. And then finally, when he does show up, he shows up to Moses after he's killed a guy in a burning bush. And then after that, Moses tries to clap back at him and tell him like, hey, I'm not going to go. I have a stuttering problem. You should just use somebody else. And he's like, no, I'm going to use you. Just bring your brother along so he could talk for you. And so they just go back and forth, and just like Moses probably makes that story come alive, because Moses, he doesn't go down easy. He's not just a yes man. He has a lot of pushback in the ways that he deals with Yahweh, which again, I'm inclined to think that's why God loves him so much, is that he's not just this kind of pushover, but God works a lot with Moses, and eventually that gets him into a little bit of trouble. But man, Moses and Yahweh just have this relationship that's it's wild and encouraging at the same time. What's up, Josh?
I think it's worth observing. The Bible mentioned that Moses actually saw, and from what I remember, he's the only Old Testament prophet who ever saw part of God's face.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to their relationship and why Moses is considered the greatest of the Jewish prophets.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, and the kind of questions that Moses asked, like, let me see your glory. Like, we'll read through that, because there's a little bit of there's a devotional that we'll read through, but like, that's a big question to ask, because Moses isn't just asking like, hey, like, tell me what to do. Like, no, let me see you in everything. Like, to get a little more descriptive, let me see everything about you. And again, it's not a dirty perversion kind of thing, but he's like, let me see you face to face. I don't just want to keep seeing your back or keep having these kinds of like mediated relationships, but let me see everything. Like, let me see.
What's
did-
more?
Oh, my bad.
What's
No, you're
more? God actually buries Moses. That's the only time we ever hear a God burying someone in the Bible.
Yeah.
And he was the only one there when Moses died.
Yeah. And what's interesting is it's usually the obligation of the family members to bury their family. Yeah. Usually the sons bury their dad. But whereas maybe Moses either didn't have kids or just, I'm telling you, they have a wild relationship, and we'll talk about that, because it's at some points it's wild and chaotic. But I don't know. To me, it's encouraging how messy it is, because I know my relationship with God, it ain't always the cleanest little walk down the aisle. That it can be quite messy. But the amount of times telling God, I don't want to do that. Don't want to do that. Like, where are you at? Like, hey, this stuff sucks. Where are you at? It's encouraging to see the kind of dynamic relationship that Moses has. And I mean, Moses has it partly easy. I think he might have a little more difficult too, because he has kind of got there face to face, but then also the pressure that, the pressure that puts on an individual is difficult. But yeah, the parting of the Red Sea, that's wild. The plagues, there's so much there. There's so much there in Exodus, but a lot of good stuff in Exodus. But what about you guys? What do you guys what are you guys looking more towards learning about more specifically? What are you guys looking forward towards learning about?
I guess the deeper significance of the laws, you
Mm.
know, for like the individual ones, because a lot of times reading the Bible growing up, or like after I came to know the Lord,
Yeah.
like I kind of just like you know, if I got to Leviticus or something, I'd be like, "Yeah, okay, you know, let's hurry up and get through this part of my devotional or whatever I was reading,
For
right?"
sure.
And then I heard someone say that the Leviticus was their favorite book of the Bible once, and I was like, really? And I was like, why?
Yeah.
And they're saying like how cool it was and this, that, or the other, and they're talking about the significance of them, and I was like, oh, I want to know more about that. I want to know how that pertains to, you know, the overall picture more, God's love, you know, for his people, whatever, you know.
Yeah, and especially if you're a science nerd, archaeology nerd, it's really interesting to go back and look up at not only what are the prescriptions that God has for people, specific in Leviticus, but to see how, because, and this is a little bit out there, but the kind of sociology and the anthropology that God's working with this early people, that um, what's most significant to have mentioned. And the fact that God does prescribe like these early kind of, I don't want to say antibiotics, but these early remedies to these issues that come, health issues that come up. And how their worship really is ordered around relationship. The why you have all these details in these sacrificial systems and why there's so many safeguards in place is so that sin doesn't get in the way. That there's a way to deal with sin. And that's, again, it's a grace that God provides. That when sin happens, God's people aren't left to their own devices to try to make it up. But no, God even provides the way to get back to himself. And so, yeah, it's, again, it takes a little bit of kind of working through, and it's not obvious on the surface, and I wish it was, but that's what we got. Anybody else? What are you guys looking forward to learning? Other than how long could you sit on Zoom without falling asleep?
I think I'm kind of excited to learn more about the Genesis accounts. So I've
Hmm.
always found that very interesting.
Yeah.
And just like the genre of myth and such, and like its purpose. I think that stuff is super cool. So
Oh yeah, definitely. And even just saying the word myth at a Christian school or in church, you're gonna get in trouble because everybody thinks
right?
when you talk about myth, you're talking about Hercules, you're talking about Zeus, you're talking about like kids' cartoons, like, and that's not the case at all when we talk about ancient Near Eastern cultures and stuff. So yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And we'll talk about that too, because especially with Genesis, that the way it functions as a kind of mythology. But again, myth meaning origin stories. Origin stories. And you guys are really familiar with that. If you think through Batman, Superman, all the Marvel characters, any character has an origin story, or kind of mythology. Sorry, the desk is shaking. A mythology. And just what that means is origins. And would I agree that Genesis 3:15 is the first prophecy of Jesus Christ? We'll talk about that when we get there, because there's a lot that I need to set up before I kind of give a final answer. But I think it could be interpreted that way. Traditionally, it's been interpreted that way. And yeah, there's more nuance than saying yes or no. And so, but I'll talk about that when we get there, though. Because yeah, traditionally it's been what we call the proto-evangelion, and I'll write that for you guys. That first gospel, and that's what traditionally it's been interpreted as. But if you take a look in the story, there's a different intention with that specific passage, more so than just trying to look forward to a Messiah. Though it can be in there, because especially with Hebrews, that there is, and you guys will know this from Biblit, and you guys will know this from cultures, that there's an expectation for Messiah to come and to deliver the people. And so it's possible that it's there. But again, I don't know if it's specifically about Jesus, but it could be, no, I don't want to say definitely, but there could be some messianic overtones there. All right, any other questions about what you guys are excited or have questions looking forward to learning about? All right. Well, let's go ahead. We'll keep going here. Again, just more information heavy. But as we start to get into the text, which we're going to start doing now, again, you'll start to see me ask more questions and a lot more interaction and group stuff. So for better or for worse. So introducing Genesis. So the Pentateuch as a whole is passed down through oral tradition. Passed down through oral tradition, the Pentateuch as a whole. And that's why I had brought up Israel's history, because there is some thought that it's during the period of post-exile, when they're being brought into the land after Cyrus lets them go back home, that's when all this stuff starts getting written down. All these stories start taking on a written form. But the way these stories are passed along in Genesis and compiled is by word of mouth. And so again, that it's a tradition that gets partnered with writing. It doesn't just completely absolve it once it starts getting written down, that it's both a story to be written down and read and also a story to be told. If you guys can jump with me over to the New Testament that you see with Jesus, I believe it's Luke 4, where Jesus is in the temple and he unrolls the scroll and he reads from it, and then he rolls it back up and puts it back. That again, it's both an oral and a written culture, but emphasis more on the oral culture, because again, that there are people that don't have scripts and don't a lot of the writing and reading was done by the priesthood. And so the way the stories were memorized, again, is through poetry and through poetical devices. And so again, that the art form helps to enhance the memory, because again, this reliance on oral tradition. And so you have these origins, that Genesis is a broad stroke, these primeval history, which we talked about already. That you have creation and violence kind of marking the two sides that coincide with one another. That you have creation for the first couple chapters, Genesis 3, which everything starts unraveling. You have Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and Abel event. Again, the beginning of violence. And then in chapter 6, it's just widespread all over the world. Then you have that recreation through the flood and the multitude of humanity, that you have the flood story that happens where God essentially hitting the restart button and then starting all over with Noah and his family. And you have ancestral history, which we refer to as the patriarchal narratives. You have Abram or Abraham for about 14 chapters. You have Isaac, and then Esau and Jacob, Israel. That's going to round it out. Of course, Joseph's story is going to finish it out. But again, Joseph's story serves as a kind of link between Genesis and Exodus. That Joseph's story serves as a link between Genesis and Exodus. It tells us, how did the Israelites end up down in Egypt? By way of a story. Again, we're not just given a kind of fact that, hey, there was a famine, it really sucked, so the Hebrews went down to Egypt. No. We have the development of a family story that is really messy. Really, really messy. And so again, those are the broad strokes for that. And so the message of Genesis 1 through 11, again, broad, and then we'll bring it down to specifics here. Message of Genesis 1 through 11. So it is going to provide us a lens for us to read the rest of Genesis. It's going to provide us a lens by which we read the rest of Genesis. I had mentioned earlier about how God being creator will factor into Abraham's stories. It's going to factor into Isaac's stories, and it's going to factor again into Jacob's stories, and even some into Joseph's as well. But that these first initial glimpses that we get of God in these 11 chapters will help us to read both the rest of Genesis and, in fact, the rest of the Pentateuch and even the Old Testament, I would dare to say. But in Genesis 1 through 11, Yahweh, which is the Hebrew name for God in the Old Testament, and I'll explain that more when we get to Exodus, has supremacy from the beginning. And I brought that up before, but to say it again, that he is without an equal in creation and the way he's ordering the world. He's uncreated, which again is unique among the ancient Near Eastern deities. And that he undermines all human structures, including the temple at Babel. But he also does work with them as well. And we'll talk about that when we get to covenant and how God works with covenant and he works with humans in that. And so Genesis 1 and 2. What you have here, what seems to be this kind of two creation accounts, part of the larger narrative, and the way that the story works is it kind of functions as an introduction to the rest of the story. You have this introduction to the rest of the story. That you have the beginnings both of material creation and the story of humanity's creation. And so again, it's not, I brought this up and I need to emphasize it because it gets lost later on, that you can't just think of birds and trees, but also again of humanity, of humankind, but then also of God's people themselves. Also of God's people. And so Genesis 1 and 2. That creation is understood in the ancient Near East. That's going to have three levels, and I'll have to bring up the picture for next class because we got about 10 minutes here. Let me go ahead and pull it up for you guys real quick because I think this will prove more helpful than just talking about it real quick. What there is that there's three levels. That you have the firmament, the waters that are above. You have the earth, which is kind of in the middle. And then you have, after that, the kind of earth below or the waters below. And the reason why I bring that up is because of the fact that the Hebrews aren't detached from culture, that they adopt some of this as well. And so what we see ordered in the Genesis account is the way, again, God is ordering creation in this, I don't want to say in this kind of not necessarily specifically with only Hebrew culture in mind, but he's definitely working with the humans in order to be able to help them understand and working within the confines of this specific culture. And I'll go ahead and pull it up so you guys can see what it is I'm talking about. No, don't do that. Okay. Let me pull it up so you guys can see what it is that I'm seeing. All right. There we go. All right. There you go. So you guys can see what it is. So waters above. Here you have the floodgates. Which again, as you're reading through Noah's story, you'll see this kind of language being utilized about how the floodgates were opened. And still, I don't know if you guys still sing this song, but there was a song a while back, Open the Floodgates of Heaven, Let It Rain. That's the reference. There's an ancient reference. You have this kind of gates that held the waters in order that they wouldn't kind of just pour out. And again, this is an ancient worldview that God works within to communicate about himself. You have the firmament up here. You have the sun, the moon, the stars that just kind of rotate around, go back and forth. The earth down here. You have Sheol down here, the place where they keep the dead. And this is just a quick kind of little, I don't want to say fun fact, but Sheol is the place of the dead. It's not hell. It's just where the dead go to await judgment. And so here's the columns that hold up the earth, because you have pillars that hold up the earth, and you'll see in the Psalms that will refer to columns or pillars holding up the earth. And then you also have, excuse me, the kind of abyss and the oceans, that the water just kind of runs off the edges into the abyss. Is Sheol another name for hell, purgatory? Not necessarily. That develops in the intertestamental period of this place of purging, because that's where purgatory comes from, is purging before you enter into heaven. And Sheol, again, it's a place where everybody goes to await judgment. So again, it's not necessarily a purging as much as it is just, it's the waiting room before death, before Yahweh comes to judge the living and the dead. And so again, so you see how when we read through Genesis 1 and 2, how God is going to begin to set these things up. And we'll talk about it more on Thursday, but how God is ordering such a creation according to the Hebrew imagination and the way that they understand the way the world works. And so I'll have this graphic, I'll copy it and post it onto the PowerPoint so that way you guys can see it and have it with you. But again, that you have God working with this kind of creation, that you have God starting with a void, formless space. And it doesn't mean that there's nothing. And I need to be clear about that. That doesn't mean there's nothing. The text doesn't indicate that. It means it was formless and void, that it didn't have shape. It didn't have order. It was chaotic. It was just in pieces. So you could think when you open up the Lego box and you just dump it all out, there's just pieces everywhere. It doesn't mean that there's nothing. It just means it hasn't been ordered or it hasn't been put together yet. And that's what Genesis is trying to get at, is that in this space that was devoid of order, Yahweh comes in and slowly creates order from these pieces. And so he's going to start from the outside, the outer firmament, and then work inward, especially in Genesis 1. He's going to start from the outside and then work his way towards inward, and he's going to end with Sabbath, but with especially, at least with created order. He's going to finish off with humans and then take a break after that. And I'll talk about why it's important to make mention that creation story doesn't end with the creation of humans. It ends with the creation of Sabbath. It ends with the creation of Sabbath. And that's really, really important. Are there any questions? Questions, comments, concerns?
So the people that that await judgment in Sheol, or I think is what it was called,
Mhm.
Are they awaiting like the final judgment? Like,
yeah, it's the final judgment. Yeah.
you make it sound a lot more exciting than it probably would be. But
Yeah, well, anytime I hear final anything, I always think that song. But yeah, no, they're awaiting judgment. That is for there's nobody gets to escape it, and it's a holding place for the dead.
by that I meant like once Jesus comes back, like are they awaiting the same day that like everybody else is, or when people die, do they go there and then have like their own days where they stand before God? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
My question.
I think we're just, but I think what's getting lost is that there's no conception necessarily of Jesus coming back. It's again, their conception is that God is judge, and that doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation. Is that it's that God's going to be the one to make the final decision on where somebody spends their eternal destiny, and so that they're awaiting the day that God will come to judge humanity. Not so much of Jesus making a return, coming down with clouds and rapture. Like that's not necessarily in their mind, especially again for early Hebrews, because there's some thought that there's a couple things that once you're dead, you're dead. There's nothing afterwards. Or once you're dead, you go to this place where you await judgment. And that's more so what's being communicated.
My question is will their judgment day be the same as like ours, right? And everybody
Oh,
else's.
now I see what you're saying. So that, yeah, so even that gets developed. That when God returns to establish his kingdom, again, you can hear the kind of overtones with Jesus, but more specifically that God's going to send a Messiah to establish his kingdom. And when the Messiah comes back, then God will judge. But that's where they're being held until that day comes around. So again, what I want to get away from is that they're specifically talking about Jesus or referring to Jesus as much as it is this kind of messianic figure that will come and reestablish God's kingdom once and for all. We take that to be Jesus. But for, again, ancient Hebrews, they're looking for a Messiah who's going to be like David and kick the crap out of these pagans and reestablish God's kingdom. The same way, again, David did. The same way, even Saul to some extent, but that they're going to establish the kingdom in the midst of these people. And Jesus doesn't necessarily do that for them. Any other questions, comments, concerns? All right. Well, if you guys don't have any more questions, you guys have an absolutely awesome Tuesday. Get some tacos, Taco Tuesday, baby. So can't miss it. You have an assignment due on Thursday, so just make sure you're doing your reading. You don't want to have it all come crashing down on Thursday. So just make sure you're working ahead. If you guys have any questions, my office hours are this afternoon from 2 to 4. So yeah, just stop by. You don't even have to make an appointment. Just pop in, say what's up. And I'll see you guys on Thursday, hopefully, if not sooner than that. But all right, you guys have an absolutely beautiful and awesome Thursday or Tuesday. I'm already on Thursday. Peace.
Thank you.
Bye,
Have a
thank
great
you.
day.
See you guys.
Thank you.